My friend had purchased a huge old rundown house that we were going to fix up and live in while we were in college. It had this beautiful Gothic gate in the backyard. When we moved into the house, we saw a postcard with a painting of that gate and a gigantic building right behind it. This building no longer existed, so we asked some neighbors and they said it used to be one of the biggest TB hospitals in the area. We already knew that a woman had died in the house, but now we had a former tuberculosis hospital in the backyard. This house had very key experiences associated with it. There were 3 spirits who were around at least weekly, 2 men who would stomp around cracking up about something. You could hear them coming in the door and stomping up the stairs, just building off each other's laughs. Often I would think it was my roommates getting home early and would go out of my room to an empty house. There was another one that sounded like a girl, either laughing or crying. I could never tell. One night I was home alone and I could hear extremely loud stomping upstairs. I called my friend, who was a bit of a ghost hunter, and he begged me to go upstairs and leave his voice recorder up there. This stairwell only had one working light switch, and that was at the top of the stairs. So I ran up the dark stairs as fast as I could and slid the voice recorder into the hallway. Later that night, he retrieved it, and without a doubt, you could hear 2 men cracking up and a young girl crying or laughing, more distant than the men. My dog used to get upset when I would leave for school or work and go find a roommate to go cuddle with. One day after class, I went into my roommate's room looking for her, and I noticed his DVD stand across the room from where it used to be, and all the DVDs were scattered about the room. I asked him what happened, and he said, "Your dog started barking, and then the stand floated in the air and got thrown to the other side." And I remember how calmly he said it, because it was just another encounter in this creepy old house. One night, I was in my bed watching television, and my dog was in bed with me. Out of the corner of my eye, near the edge of my bed, I saw a cloud form right in front of me, and it was about the size of a beach ball. It looked like a sped-up video of a storm building. I saw my dog sit up and was staring at it with me. About that time, it zoomed out of my room, and my dog's head followed it out my door and toward the basement. We both saw it, and both moved our heads at the same speed. A few months later, my ghost hunter roommate came in and told me that he had seen a dark object form right beside him, and when he looked at it, it flew down into the basement. I had never told anyone about what I'd seen, and he described it exactly the same as what I saw. No one ever felt comfortable in the basement, almost like something was watching you. And I feel that whatever it was a shadow creature. I should also tell you about one of the bedrooms. One of the bedrooms had an interesting ability to give you nightmares. Not just any nightmares. They were almost always nightmares of you slitting someone's throat, usually a loved one. Your mother, father, sister, friend. It didn't matter. I remember one time the room was empty and we had someone spend the night in there because it was too late to go home. The next morning he came out and said, "I had the craziest dream." And I started laughing and asked, "Whose throat did you slit?" He went white as a ghost and said that is exactly what his dream was about. Everyone who lived in that room had the same nightmares, and everyone moved out shortly after. I lived in that room for a while, but it was just too much for me. Even if I wasn't killing someone in my dreams, I would often wake up sweating from another nightmare, and once I actually sat up in the bed screaming like you see in the movies. Thank you, Jared. I grew up in the Bronx, New York in the 1970s, and I was one of 3 children. My mother and father met when she was working as a nurse, and he had been in construction. He had been hurt on a job and went to the hospital where he would meet my mother, and this was in 1956. They were married for 9 years and had 3 children, and my father was a typical Italian man back then, and no wife of his was going to work. So my mother was at home with all of his kids, and my father worked. My father seemed to always be out of work and became an alcoholic, and was very abusive to my mother. He never hurt us kids, but treated my mother horrible. The Bronx in the 70s was a horrible place, and one night as my father was walking home from a bar, he was robbed and shot. He was found dead 2 days later in an open lot. Now it was just my mother and my brother and my sister and me. We had to move out of the apartment we had because we couldn't afford the rent, and that place was a dump, but now we moved into a worse place on Prospect Avenue. I'm not going to give the address because I think the building is still there. My mother eventually got a job as a nurse again, but we still could not afford a better place, and there were a lot of nights us kids were home alone. Right from the start, when we moved into the building, weird things happened. At night, you could hear footsteps in the apartment when none of us were walking. One night, someone was knocking at our door, and my mother was home that time. She went to the door and looked out the peephole, and there was no one there, but they knocked again. Thinking someone was trying to get her to open the door, she laid down and looked under the door, but no one was there. My brother, who was 16 at the time, grabbed a baseball bat and went to the door. He pulled the chain back but left the deadbolt locked and waited. When the knock came again, he threw the deadbolt and opened the door, and there was no one anywhere. Another time, my sister, who had been upstairs at another girl's apartment, started banging on the door screaming, "Let me in." I jumped up and let her in, and she said that she was coming down the stairs and an old woman was coming up the stairs toward her and then just vanished. One night as I was laying in bed, I felt someone get in bed with me. I thought it was my sister, but I opened my eyes and no one was there. The scariest thing that happened to me was one night I was sitting in the bedroom alone and I was listening to the radio when this man came through my closed door and walked straight into my closet. And just seconds later, I heard banging coming from the closet. I jumped up and ran out of the room and got my brother. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went into the room thinking someone was there, jerked open the closet door, and again, no one. We all had heard that banging noise coming from that closet at different times. And there was an older lady who lived across the hall from us, and I would go over there and help her clean her apartment or whatever she needed me to do, and she would give me a little money. She had lived there since the early 1960s, and she told me that weird occurrences have always happened. I told her about the man going into the closet and the banging noise, and she told me that when she had first moved in, that a man that lived there hung himself and that the banging noise was his feet kicking as he was hanging. My mother eventually remarried, and our stepdad moved us to New Jersey, where I live now. He was a great man and really became the father we never had. But I will never forget that horrible building and the frightening things that happened there. Thank you, Theresa. I was a 17-year-old California girl who traveled to Boston for college. It was the beginning of my second semester of my freshman year in 1994. Everything was still new to me from traveling cross-country, getting on the T subway and then changing at South Station to get on a commuter rail to Mansfield, Massachusetts. The delays at the airport made me have to take the last train out of South Station. It was dark, it was very late, and it was freezing. It was at the end of January, and there was at least 2 feet of snow everywhere. As the commuter rail stopped at each crossing, the train stations became smaller and more remote, and the cars quieter and quieter. Soon it was me and 2 other passengers. These 2 male passengers looked a bit older than me and kept glancing at me, whispering and glancing back. They started making loud comments about how isolated it was and how they could do whatever they wanted with me. They were making me feel not just uncomfortable, but scared, and I did my best to ignore them and kept reading my book. When I got to the Mansfield train station, I got off with my large piece of luggage, which had no wheels at the time, and I had to do my best to drag it off the car onto the train platform. The train left the station. I noticed there was 1 taxi cab. Unfortunately, there was 10 people. I was the only female. The 2 guys that were on the train were on my left and began nudging each other and making crude remarks under their breath. I was getting very scared by this point. The taxi driver got out and yelled, "Okay, who goes first?" A loud voice to my right yells, "She goes in the cab." Standing on the platform just behind me was a man in a train conductor uniform. He looked to be in his 30s, dark black hair, the same height as me, but otherwise looked like a typical train conductor. He proceeded to start telling people what to do and where to go. I put my luggage in the far back of the cab, sat down next to 2 other passengers, and the train conductor got in the front passenger seat next to the driver. We dropped the 2 other people that were in the back seat with me in Mansfield, and then headed to my college dorm. When we got to my college, I paid the driver, and the taxi driver got out to help me with my luggage. The train conductor said, "Have a nice semester, ma'am." I thanked him and got out of the cab. I grabbed the luggage and the taxi driver opened the door and started to get back into his cab. As I was turning to unlock the door to my dorm, the taxi driver yelled at me, "Hey, where did the conductor go?" There was a small platform to get up to my dorm and could see all around me, up and down the street. There were no cars but the taxi in front of me. No bushes the conductor could have quickly hidden in, and there was no one but the taxi cab driver and myself. The driver double-checked in the cab. He was yelling, "Hey, conductor guy, we're ready to go." Quiet, no answer. The taxi driver said to me, "That was weird." And I agreed, that was weird. He turned and left to go back to the station. I told my roommate what had happened, and she said for me to do some research to find out if there were any accidents at the station. Since my degree was in history, I took it upon myself to find out what happened. And this is what I found out. After midnight on Monday, May 24th, 1926, the Owl, a midnight express from Boston to New York, collided with a Providence Low freight train in Mansfield, Massachusetts. Freight cars and passenger coaches were strewn all over the tracks. The engine and 1 coach were overturned, and 2 boxcars were crushed in the crash. A train conductor was killed, and his name was Ernest Ridding. I don't know if it was a ghost that helped me out that night or a guardian angel, but either way, I was and am still thankful. Desiree.